Hey guys, what's up? It's filtersc here, and we're going to be doing flash tips today. Today's topic of discussion is going to be about the mouse control, and how the mouse is heavily undervalued when it comes to moving your army around, handling multiple points of engagement, kind of splitting your army up, and dealing with fights that spread themselves out a little bit. In the background, you're going to notice a few different games, a few different kind of highlights that I pulled off from my stream the other night. And those videos are just to emphasize that a little bit, show how you use the mouse to move around the map, to grab your upgrades, to pull units, just to kind of move and shuffle everything around. The mouse is by far the most undervalued asset and aspect of people when they play StarCraft 2. And the reason I'm making this video is actually because in one of the last videos, there was a bunch of comments about hotkey setups and stuff like that. And hotkeys are great, and you really do need to use them. You'll see me jump around a lot using my hotkeys, either jump into my army, jump into a harassment unit, jumping around bases with camera hotkeys and stuff like that. It's all very important, but you don't want to overload your keyboard. You don't want to rely on it too much. It's not going to help you if you try to split up your units and handle multiple points of engagement, and you're trying to always keep everything that's involved in those fights hotkeyed. It's much better to be able to box those groups and box small areas of your army to move them around to handle different areas of fights. And we're going to culminate it by really going over a really cool TBT situation where mouse control plays into it heavily and lets me really win it in pretty dominating fashion. As well as finally, we're going to close it out after that by looking at a player who's much higher level than me in X5 Pig, who's a WCS caster right now, but he's also played in WCS. He's an extremely high level Grandmaster Zerg. The guy has some of the sickest mouse control I've ever seen. And there's lots of great highlights of it. As well as when you guys are watching tournaments like the WCS, like Pro League, like whatever, you're going to notice they'll pull the first-person camera quite often. And look at how well those players use their mouse to control their units and move them around. They're not trying to add everything to 19 different hotkeys. In general, you want to use a hotkey to get your army from point A to point B. But after that, you want to start using your mouse a lot more heavily in the fight. You want to use it to move the camera around. That way you can macro in the background without getting everything out of position and having to worry about it too much. So with that in mind, we're going to jump right on in here. So the first thing I kind of mentioned was using it for army movement and to organize your units. So one of the biggest things you're going to notice as you look at higher and higher level streamers, you're going to see that their army, rather than moving out in like a big line or a block or anything like that, they'll be constantly reshuffling it. There's a ton of great players out there. I don't want to name names because I'll leave somebody out. But there's a lot of great players you can watch do this, and they're constantly reorganizing their army. They're moving units around. They're making sure their army is always setting up. So it's going to be in some sort of concave, because one of the hardest things to do in StarCraft 2 is actually win a fight when your army is mispositioned. So if you haven't taken the time to set it up properly, so it's going to be ready to go in a concave from the most likely attack angle, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. That's also why you see flanks and stuff like that happen a lot more at a professional level, because if you flank somebody's army and it's kind of set up in a big line compared to your army that's in an arc, your army's it's going to hammer it even if you're significantly down in supply. And that's one of the biggest aspects of the game of StarCraft 2, is making sure your army is always in a good spot. It's always accurately controlled. It's ready to fight at all times. The next part is you got to lower your DPI. I'm going to pull up my own mouse settings, and basically for me, I like to run at about 600 DPI. That's kind of my sweet spot. That's where I feel I can get the most out of my mouse and get the most out of my mouse control. That seems extremely low, and it is. I initially used to play at 1800 DPI, and I couldn't micro for anything, right? There are some players that use high DPI, but the vast majority of really high-level players have extremely low DPI, and they're very accurate with their mouse control. Maru, who's known the most for his micro, at least right now, is a player who uses 450 DPI. You talk to a lot of Counter-Strike players, and they'll use even lower than that. They just go insane. Their mouse has to move almost the entire width of their desk, right? That's why you see those great big mouse pads for those guys. You don't need to go that crazy, because speed is still important in StarCraft 2, but accuracy is the most important factor. So you want to be able to move your mouse quickly and accurately, and the best way to do that is just to lower your DPI. Quick little wrist flicks are not how you move quickly. I can move almost as fast as somebody who's running at 1800 DPI at my 600 or 700 DPI, but I'm going to be a lot more accurate, just significantly more accurate than they ever will be, or even can potentially be. With some exceptions, there are guys that are just kind of freaks that work on the high DPI. So you need to get used to it. You need to lower your DPI. It'll make you a lot more accurate. Doesn't matter what game you play. you're going to be more accurate if you have lower DPI. So make sure you get that tweaked. Depending on your mouse, you'll need to download drivers and stuff like that to flip it down. It's not a big deal to do. And if you want to get used to it quickly, one of the best ways to do it is just set it for your desktop and use it when you're browsing the internet, browsing Reddit, browsing Team Liquid, whatever, it doesn't matter. You'll get used to it quite quickly. It is one of the easiest changes to make. It only takes a day or two to get used to. Initially, it'll feel really, really sluggish and really slow and hard to deal with. But once you get used to it, and like I said, it only takes a couple of days, you'll be ready to go and you'll feel absolutely fantastic when you go play the game of StarCraft 2. So with that being said, let's take a look at the key points of using a mouse. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a game from the perspective of the replay and my camera and all that stuff, and we're just going to take a look at small pieces of it and kind of set the table for you. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the more advanced part of the game from first person, where you can kind of see that mouse control and that mouse movement start to come into play, much more so than it appears within the replay, right? So the first thing I'm going to say to set the table here, and we're going to put it on everybody so we can see the whole thing here. My opponent's doing an aggressive build. He ends up going for a Hellion drop with some Marines, and it's a pretty strong build if you don't defend it properly. Now, I started the game off with a couple of Reapers to manage to get a couple of kills nice and early. I've also gone for an expansion-based build, which is going to let me get an advantage if I'm able to hold off his attack. The keys to holding off his attack are the fact that I'm going to be getting a tank relatively quickly, as well as I'm going to get a Viking, and I'm able to make a bunch of Marines. I also have really good vision inside of my own base, and I have a bunker at the front, so I'm not too worried about a direct frontal push being able to kill me, right? With a small number of units early on, he's not going to have the damage to cut through that if I just pull SCVs and repair. So I'm feeling pretty comfortable. However, my opponent is, like I said, doing a fairly aggressive build, so I have to keep that in mind, and we'll take a look at kind of what happens here. You'll see the defense and supply right now is fairly even. After the attack, it changes significantly. So the first thing is I've got a couple Marines in place. I need to take out the medevac right away, and I'm able to do that, right? You can kind of see my hockey setup at the bottom. I actually really don't have any units other than my Viking and a hockey. And my units that kind of come out from the barracks here, I'm going to spread them out, get them in a line, and then just pull the SCVs here to finish off this, because, you know, pulling the boys, losing a little bit of mining time is not a big deal if I can clean up the attack super efficiently. The one thing to note is if I don't kill the medevac with my Viking, then that stuff's not possible. At the same time, he goes for a little bit of a run by on my SCVs. It's only 2 Hellions, so what I end up doing is I wrap all my SCVs around and go after them that way. And because I do something like that, you're going to see I lost about 5 workers. Compared to what he lost is a pretty big deal, right? I really didn't lose very much. And you can see the supplies much different now after that attack, right? My opponent has a command center to expand with, but his tech is fairly delayed. His production, while he's building it now, doesn't really have very many units on the field or anything like that, right? And to compensate, because of the bank, he ends up going for a 3rd CC, which is totally fine. But we're going to take a second look at that attack from the perspective of the actual mouse movement in the control of the defense, right? So let's take a look at that. Okay, now we've got the live video up, and what's happening right now is I'm just kind of setting everything up and getting ready. I'm actually playing the video at half speed so we can really talk about all the different mouse movement and that stuff like that. A large part of this is not efficient, but it's easier to talk about it at half speed because it's easier for me to show you and tell you everything that's going on. I do have the mouse cursor up and all that stuff on the video, but you're going to see a lot of like really small boxing, a lot of clicking on buildings and stuff like that, and really pushing my mouse usage to essentially what is like the maximum capability you're going to have. Now when you see quick snaps in the camera like that, that's a situation where I'm like, okay, I need to go mule, so I hit my camera hotkey and I jump to the base and jump back and all that stuff. Now the attack is coming up, so you're going to see me shuffle out, and if you notice I'm edge scrolling to move the camera as much as possible. There's a lot of middle mouse button clicking, which is really bad. You want to edge scroll. It's the best way to get your micro to the maximum capability. But I've kind of identified what he's doing now. I scouted it fairly early on, so I was a little bit more comfortable in dealing with it offensively, and it's pretty simple. I'm just getting my Viking out there. I'm going to hotkey my Viking separately, as you can see. The whole point of my Viking is to kill off that medevac. He is doing a fairly committed attack, which is why he's going to be super aggressive about getting in there initially. And you're going to see the Viking is kind of the main focus right now. And he knows that too, but I'll get my Viking out of there safely. Once I've killed off the medevac, I feel pretty comfortable. being able to take out the rest of the army. If you notice, I'm grabbing and boxing that single Marine to pull it back and pull it away from the fight. I'm not worried about too much else that's going on right now. And you can see I'm boxing my Marines now to try to get them involved in the fight. And I'm going to pull the SCVs here. Now I'm going to try to get the Viking out of there. And, at half speed, it looks really simple and straightforward and easy. I'm comfortable that I'm going to win that fight, so I've just kind of abandoned it. If you notice, the only unit I really have on a hotkey right now is my Viking, because, I've got Marines that came out of a bunker, and I've got spawning units as my army. So I'm not too worried about, sticking them in a hotkey straight away. And for something like this, it's just, like I said, getting the quick surround on the Hellions to take them out. And now I can go grab all my army. You're going to see I'm going to control click on my SCVs to put them back to work, and then I'm going to reset all the gas and stuff like that in a second. Make sure I get my mules back down. I'm going to grab these SCVs, put them back to work, and that attack is actually a fairly aggressive one and can be quite difficult to hold depending on the situation, right? But when you slow the video right down and you take a look at the mouse movements there, that's very simple and very straightforward. And the reason that attack looks so easy to hold is because it's at least decent quality mouse movement that I'm taking full advantage of to hold the attack. I'm not trying to panic with like 19 hotkeys and stuff like that. It's just really simple, clean, basic gameplay. And I only lost 5 SCVs in the attack compared to my opponent who did it in a very committed way and ended up taking a fairly large supply lead after. Now, if you'll notice, the last thing I'm doing is kind of spreading everything back out. I'm going to repair the Viking and all that and get myself, resorted and all that kind of stuff, and maintain vision over my base, because, drops on this map can be very devastating if you're not watching for them. Just having a couple of Marines out there is going to let me spot them well in advance. And then finally, I can kind of go back to doing my build the way I want to do it. I've got a large gas bank, so I'm not going to want to take my gases too early, and just kind of move on from there. The other thing to take note of is Vikings are your key defensive early unit, right? So a lot of people complain about TVT and dying to early attacks. There's even a thread on All Things Terran about it. The Vikings are your key defensive unit early on. The other one that's really good are Hellions, depending on what type of build you're doing. But this is just that battle. We're going to take a look at another one from this game in a more advanced stage, so let's jump over on to that. Alright, so we're now on to the next part of the game, and we're going to take a look at this as well. And this is just the final engagement. Now, I've built myself a pretty good advantage throughout the game. You can see I've killed a bunch of his workers at his third base. We're both kind of taking our fourth bases at around the same time. Mine's a little bit ahead. His upgrades are actually finished. He does have 2-2 to my 1-1. That does matter in TBT, but if you have a bigger army and you can get a better concave, it actually isn't that big of a deal. So rushing for upgrades is not always the greatest thing ever. They are important, but they're not always worth it. Now, what you're going to see is my opponent has noticed my army moving out because he had a Marines kind of spotting this area. And he's a little bit unprepared for it, so you can see I've got a big stim to come in. I am hurting on medevacs, so I don't want to overstim my army, and I end up kind of doing that a little bit anyway. But you're going to see I get a much better arc, I get a better concave. You can see how these units are moving forward, and that's what I currently have selected. And my tanks are starting to lag behind, which isn't a great thing. But you're going to see I kind of push up, and then when it gets to the point where he's going to be able to get a better concave because I don't know what's behind it, that's when I kind of back off a little bit. Now, one thing to note is obviously the supplies now are massively in my favor, and before the fight they really weren't. I've managed to do a ton of damage to his army, and now I need to get myself in a position to kill him off, right? And I don't have things like my tanks hotkeyed separately. I do have everything for the most part in one big hotkey. I've got my reinforcements rallying across that I've kind of hotkeyed across, which I'm going to need my extra units here. But what I don't want to do is push into this choke, right? I don't want to have my army in this big ball and try to plow through all this stuff, because it won't actually work, especially when I'm down on upgrades. So what I end up doing is pulling my tanks, and you're going to notice how I kind of move them forward. And then you can see I'm spreading out units and starting to set up an arc, because what I want to do is pressure this third base that I've already attacked a bunch, rather than trying to push into his main, and really put pressure on him to missplit his army and take a bad fight. So despite the supply advantage, I can very easily, take a really bad fight and end up throwing it away, and then losing my advantage in the game, because you're going to see, like, obviously his upgrades are a little bit further ahead, but it's not too big of a deal. And again, we're setting up the arc, slowly moving our units forward. You can see, like, this is not something you can push into to fight. It's just not going to work. And as I start to max out, I feel like I'm in much better shape. Again, I've got a bunch of units at home. It's not too big of a deal. I don't need to pull them forward or anything. You know, maybe he has a drop or something flying out. I actually don't have a tank defensively. My main base is quite wide open right now. Basically nothing in my third either. So I would be in a lot of trouble if he had counter pressure, but he has to keep everything at home. And what I'm doing now is I'm just pulling small groups of units across to try to fight at different spots, right? I notice his marine count appears to be really lacking, so I'm like, okay, well, I'm maxed out. I can trade a few units off, and I'm going to dive for these tanks. And you're going to see, I'm going to, like, these marines are going to get absolutely chewed and roasted, right? But I got rid of the 2 tanks, and I'm able to pull back, and at the same time, I have units up here fighting. And this is where the boxing starts to become a lot more important, and splitting your army and taking smaller engagements rather than grabbing everything at once and diving forward, right? You notice I use a small group of marines here to kill that. I have a small group of marines heading up here. And if I was burning everything off in hotkeys, these splits wouldn't be quite as strong. Yes, you can re-hotkey and all that stuff, but it's not always what you want to be doing all the time. And he's not able to push in and break that. It's too strong of a position, and his third's getting pressured, right? So it's, you know, when you see stuff like that, that's kind of what you're looking for when you're trying to get better with your mouse control, right? You want to be able to grab small groups of units. You want to grab, you know, these guys and run them in. You want to grab these guys and just run them up here, right? You know, lots of clicks on the mini-map. Obviously, I don't have full vision of his extra base, so I'd probably pressure that too. But lots of small clicks, you know, using the mini-map to roll around. I don't have a drop flying in or anything like that. But just, you want to use your you want to use your hotkeys to move large portions of your army. So if I wanted to move all of this stuff back home or something, I would, you know, hotkey it and move it back home. But when you start to get into the small engagements and the small fights, you really want to be focusing on using your mouse to grab small groups of units to pull them around. And I'm going to show you that because we're going to take a look at this particular fight from my stream in real time. Or, sorry, we're going to look at it at half speed and kind of talk about it a little bit more. And then finally, we're going to look at Pig, who has fantastic mouse control. Much, much better than mine. But this is just one small example. So let's jump into that and take a look at a real game. Alright, so now we've got the real game pulled up. I've thrown a scan down on my opponent's army, and you're going to kind of see I'm using, if you notice, I'm using my main army hotkey right now to kind of move everything over. But when the fight starts, that's going to completely change. So the fight starts, and you're going to see me box kind of on the right side of my army. You see the control click on the tanks to get them to siege up. My opponent doesn't really have very many tanks, so he didn't necessarily have that option. And I right now just have a small portion of my army selected, and I'm kind of target firing medevacs down, target firing tanks down with that portion, while the other portion is on a move. As that starts to break apart and my army starts to kind of get separated a little bit and not be in an optimal position, I'm going to pull it back a little bit. And you notice we pull everything back, and now we're reorganizing it. So if he does come to fight it, it is set up in an arc. We've got some siege tanks behind it, and I need to move my other tanks up. After scanning his army, I'm going to look to get a nice position in a fairly strong concave, because I know, you know, this chance of siege tank fire coming back on them is a little bit lower. Now again, I've got my tanks. The tanks are a part of the main army hotkey, but I'm using boxes to grab my units that I want to control. And you can see we're starting to get them spread out. We have some marines defending the tanks. I don't have a ton of units that are set up in you know, really bad positions out alone, and they're not getting disorganized, right? I feel like my position of my army right now is very, very strong, because we've got to set up to deal maximum damage and hit up the best possible concave it can. Again, you can see constant reorganizing, and I want to remind you this video is being played back at half speed, so it's not a case of you know, obviously this is happening much faster in real time or whatever. Again, we're just grabbing our tanks in small groups, right? I'm, you know, basically in that case, like individually clicking and unsieging them, because I don't want to box select and grab some marines or anything like that. And while I can grab all my tanks and put them in a hotkey and siege them that way, and I used to try to do that actually, it ends up not being very efficient when you start dealing with these kinds of fights where things start to get spread out and separate, right? You want to be able to control individual groups of your army well, rather than dealing with big, huge fights. Another example here. He's going after a couple of tanks with a small group of his units. I don't want my whole army to stem in, because then parts of it will peel off and get ripped by those tanks on the right. I don't want to. That's not the situation I want to be in, right? So the units that are fighting are units that I'm boxing and bringing to the fight. Now, here I've grabbed a small group of marines that I'm going to use to pick off the tanks. I have another group up to the north that is kind of moving up towards his base. And I've got all my units in smaller groups rather than relying heavily on different hotkeys for all these different groups and trying to reorganize that constantly. I want to have my units set up in a nice siege line. I want them to be set up in a really, really powerful arc, and I want small groups of stuff fighting all over the map. I don't want things to get disorganized, and I don't want to feed off free units. Now, at this point, obviously, my opponent tried to push in, and the game was over because he really didn't have very much after all the harassment and that kind of stuff, right? But that just goes to show you how important that mouse movement is. So let's jump into the next game, and let's take a look at what Pig has to offer with some of his gameplay and his mouse control, and talk about that just a little bit before we end off the video, guys. Alright, guys, now we're taking a look at X5 Pig, who's been casting a whole bunch of WCS. I'm sure you guys have seen him, as well as he's played in previous WCSs. The guy's a super high GM Zerg on I think all 3 servers. I know he's been GM on Korea, and the guy's an absolute monster. So what's important to look at is how good his mouse control is. It's very fast in terms of how it moves around, but you see him, he is using hotkeys and he is leaning heavily on them for, a large portion of his army. But as he needs to spread things out, as things get a little bit crazy, as he starts to do run-bys and stuff like that, the mouse plays a major role in his gameplay. Now, he is snapping around with camera hotkeys and stuff like that, but if you notice when he goes to inject, for instance, it's a camera hotkey followed up by mouse movement to grab the queen and inject and all that. He's not trying to do stuff like the backspace technique, although he does do it from time to time if you watch his stream. And especially as the game gets later and gets a little more chaotic, right? Ends up being a little bit faster for him. But just look at how important the mouse is to his gameplay, right? Like, you saw a little bit of what I did, and yeah, it was like, okay, it was fine. Look at how few misclicks there are in terms of the way he's playing right now, and look at how driven by the mouse his gameplay is, right? He really only has the one group of units that's set up as a hotkey group, right? And he's going to jump to that, not necessarily use it to control them, right? That's a major point when you start looking at the way he's using his mouse. Again, tons of clicks on the mini map, right? There's a little bit of overboxing, nowhere near as bad as what I do. He's extremely efficient with the way his mouse is being used. It's like pulling the lings back, control clicking the hydras to target down the oracles. Just very simple stuff like that, right? You can see he's broken off a ling to go scout out the extra base. He's broken off a small pack of lings, and it's all driven through mouse movement, right? It's not leaning extremely heavily on his hotkeys, even though he does make great use of them, and that's a major part of his gameplay. But look at how important and how effective his mouse is. When you start looking at your own games and you see your mouse like kind of just hanging around doing nothing, picture how much extra speed you can get by utilizing something like your mouse to control the game a little bit more, right? That's where these players get their super high level of micro, right? They use their hotkeys to jump around a lot. They use their mouse to kind of box and grab their small amounts of units. You see like a small Hydra run by over there. Again, that harassment group of Hydra list isn't hotkeyed. He has to click on the mini-map to utilize them, right? But he's making full use of them. He's not pulling, everything together with a big Great All Army hotkey. He's fighting in 3 different places at once, absolutely picking this Protoss player apart, while macroing back at home, right? You notice how he's always, he might miss a few injects here and there and stuff like that, right? But he's always producing out of his larva. He's using his keyboard to continuously produce that macro on top of jump around the map to different locations, right? You see now he's got a little bit of time to do an inject, and it's very, very important that you learn how to use your mouse properly and to the best of your ability, right? Going through and clicking on the sentries, that's obvious. That's not the hardest thing in the world to do. But all the stuff that kind of leaned up to that, right? Even something like dropping in the changelings to go scout and get vision and stuff like that. Again, he's got multiple different fronts, multiple different fights, stuff going on all over the place, and it's not all driven through hotkey. A large part of it is, but a bigger part is all mouse movement, right? Like that group of Hydras has never been hotkeyed, and they're still alive. How many players would have sacrificed those, right? But that group of Hydras has done an absolutely tremendous amount of damage, and he's using it to work with the Mutalisks. It's insane to see a player be able to take that good of control of his army, right? Again, using that small group of units to go harass while this fight's going on. You're going to notice his army right now, it's retreating, right? After it retreats and he goes to regather it, he's going to start to pull his units back together. He's going to set up a concave, set up an arc, and all that stuff. He is taking up to up to Vipers and all that stuff now, so he can properly win the fight. But he's not going to let his army sit in a really bad place. He's not going to let his army sit in a location where it's going to be very easy to have it picked off, right? When he gets a moment, you're going to see him move his army back out when he's comfortable, when he wants to move it out, and it's not going to be moved out in a big ball or a big line or anything like that, right? Again, it's all about that mouse movement, right? He's kind of breaking units off now. You're going to see after he crosses the bridge. See how he's kind of splitting them up already to get the flank? He's not letting his army kind of ball up or anything like that, right? He's got multiple different sets of units all over the place, and he's boxing them like crazy to get them spread out and to take a proper engagement. The Protoss player stands no chance when a player is pushing this hard, right? And this is the kind of stuff you want to look for when you watch somebody who streams who is really, really good at the game and like way better than me. You should see Pig when he does the smaller, Ling Bane based fights, right? You can see now it's a big retreat. He's boxing, he's grabbing his army, he's pulling it all back to make sure he grabs it all so it's not sloppy, right? You notice how few units are sloppily being moved around. Again, spreading everything out, right? Just being smart about it. And again, there's nothing sloppy about the way he's playing. And that's what can kind of happen if you start to try too hard to focus on using hotkeys to control everything, right? If you're trying to set up a flank with two different attack paths and you try to hotkey them separately, it actually ends up being a little bit easier sometimes to just separately grab your different units and box them and pull them into fights than to simply hit a hotkey. Hitting a hotkey sounds easier, but you have to hit the hotkey, move the units with the A move, make sure your mouse is in position. But if you have good mouse mechanics, and Pig has excellent mouse mechanics, the way he's able to box from every direction, when he goes to grab his units, so he can box them while grabbing something or doing something with his keyboard like macroing. Then he can go to box his units, and at the same time he's boxing in the direction he needs to attack, right? Same sort of thing. The Vipers are easily grabbing everything. He sends them back, kicks them out because he doesn't want them to die when they're out of energy, and it's just so fast and just lightning quick and near perfect handling of almost every fight and almost every engagement. In this case, he's waiting for, I think he's going to tech to Ultralisk here. I know he brought the tech up. He's got a ton of bank. Not sure how the rest of the game is going to go. But I did want to show you this portion of this game because I felt it really emphasized, when he was doing the multiple attacks, multiple fronts, multiple different sorts of aggression, how vital and important the mouse movement is to that style of gameplay, guys. And, if you want to watch him, you can find his link and stuff like that in the stream. I highly recommend you watch him because the guy's an absolute god. And I will see you guys next time.